The Wyoming Territory stretched endless and unforgiving beneath a sky the color of old pewter, where storm clouds gathered like dark thoughts on the horizon. Samuel Cordero urged his sorrel gelding across the windswept prairie, the autumn grass brittle beneath the horse's hooves and the first bite of winter sharp in the air. He had been riding since before dawn, checking the distant corners of his ranch for strays before the weather turned mean. But now the approaching storm made him anxious to reach home. Samuel had come to this land 5 years ago with nothing but hope and determination, carving out a modest spread in country that most folks considered too harsh for civilized living. He had chosen this particular valley because of its natural shelter and the clear stream that ran year-round, fed by springs high in the mountains. It was good land, honest land, and he had learned to love its stark beauty even when it tested his endurance. The wind carried the scent of snow as he crested a low ridge, and Samuel pulled up short at what he saw in the valley below. A lone figure sat motionless beside the stream, hunched over in a way that spoke of either deep meditation or profound exhaustion. The man's horse lay nearby, clearly dead, and even from this distance, Samuel could see the steam rising from the animal's body in the cold air. Samuel studied the scene carefully before approaching. The figure was clearly Indian, probably Shoshone, based on his clothing and the way he wore his long hair in braids. This was Shoshone Territory, or had been until the treaties pushed the tribes onto reservations. But this man was alone, far from any settlement, and his dead horse suggested he was in serious trouble. As Samuel drew closer, he could see that the Indian was an older man, perhaps 60, with the weathered face of someone who had spent his entire life outdoors. He wore traditional clothes that had seen better days, and around his neck hung the kind of ornate beadwork that marked him as a person of importance. When he looked up at Samuel's approach, his eyes held the kind of deep sadness that comes from watching a way of life slowly die. "Afternoon?" Samuel called out, keeping his voice friendly but cautious. "Looks like you're having some trouble." The Indian studied him for a long moment before responding in accented but clear English. "My horse stepped in a prairie dog hole. Broke his leg. I had to put him down." Samuel dismounted and walked over to examine the dead animal. It was a fine horse, clearly well cared for, and the clean bullet wound behind its ear showed that its owner had done what needed to be done, quickly and mercifully. "I'm sorry for your loss," Samuel said, meaning it. Any man who had spent time on the frontier understood the bond between a rider and his horse. "That's a hard thing to have to do." The Indian nodded gravely. "He was a good horse, carried me faithfully for 12 years. His spirit will run free in the next world." Samuel looked at the darkening sky, then at the older man sitting by his dead horse. "Storm's coming in fast. You got somewhere to shelter?" "I will find a place among the rocks. I have weathered storms before." Samuel knew that was probably true, but he also knew that the approaching weather looked particularly vicious. The kind of storm that could kill a man, especially one without proper shelter or a way to keep warm. "My ranch house is about 10 miles south of here," Samuel said carefully. "You're welcome to ride out the storm there, if you've a mind to." The Indian looked at him with surprise. "You would invite a stranger into your home? A Shoshone stranger?" "I would invite any man facing a blizzard into my home," Samuel replied. Color of his skin doesn't change the fact that freezing to death is a miserable way to die. For the first time, the hint of a smile touched the Indian's lips. "You speak wisdom, but I have no horse. I cannot reach your ranch on foot before the storm arrives." Samuel looked at his own horse, then at the Indian, then at the gathering clouds. He was making a decision that went against every bit of practical wisdom he had ever learned about frontier survival. A man's horse was his lifeline in this country, more valuable than gold and harder to replace. But sometimes the right thing to do wasn't the practical thing. "Take mine," he said simply. The Indian stared at him in disbelief. "What?" "Take my horse. He knows the way to my ranch. Just give him his head and he'll take you straight there." "I'll walk." "That is impossible. You will die in the storm." Samuel pointed to a line of cottonwoods about 2 miles away. "See those trees? There's an old line shack there, built by the previous owner. It's got a good roof and a stone fireplace. I can make it there before the worst hits, then ride out the storm in comfort. Your need is greater than mine." The Indian stood slowly, his expression grave. "Why would you do this? Give up your horse to a stranger?" Samuel considered the question. "Because you're stranded, and I'm not. Because helping each other is what separates men from animals. Because—" he paused, searching for the right words. "Because I figure the world's got enough troubles without good people refusing to help each other when they can." The Indian studied Samuel's face for a long moment, as if looking for signs of deception or ulterior motive. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him, because he nodded slowly. "I am called Washakie," he said formally. "I am chief of the eastern Shoshone, though my people now live on the Wind River Reservation." Samuel felt his eyebrows rise. Washakie was a legendary figure throughout the territory, known for his wisdom, his skill as a warrior, and his attempts to find peaceful coexistence with white settlers. To find such a man stranded and alone was both surprising and troubling. "Samuel Cordero," he replied, extending his hand. "And I'm honored to meet you, Chief Washakie. I've heard your name spoken with respect by both whites and Indians." Washakie clasped his hand firmly. "The honor is mine, Samuel Cordero. Your kindness will not be forgotten." Samuel helped the chief gather his few belongings, then showed him how to handle the sorrel. "His name is Dancer. He's got a good heart and strong legs, but he can be stubborn sometimes. Just be firm with him and he'll do right by you." Washakie swung up into the saddle with the fluid grace of a man who had been riding since childhood. "I will take good care of your horse, but how will you get home after the storm?" "I'll figure something out. Maybe the storm won't be as bad as it looks." Samuel glanced at the increasingly ominous sky. "You better get moving. That weather's not going to wait for us to finish our conversation." Washakie gathered the reins, then looked down at Samuel with an expression of deep respect. "You have shown me a kindness that few white men would offer. This creates a debt that must be repaid." "No debt," Samuel said firmly, "just one man helping another. Among my people, there are always debts to be repaid and honors to be acknowledged," Washakie replied. "I will remember this day, Samuel Cordero." Samuel watched the chief ride away across the prairie, sitting the sorrel like he had been born to it. Within minutes, horse and rider had disappeared over a distant ridge, leaving Samuel alone with a dead horse and a rapidly approaching storm. The walk to the line shack was harder than Samuel had expected. The wind picked up steadily, driving stinging pellets of snow before it, and the temperature dropped so fast he could feel his breath crystallizing in his mustache. By the time he reached the shelter, his hands were so numb he could barely work the latch on the door. The cabin was small but sturdy, built of thick logs and chinked tight against the weather. There was a good supply of firewood stacked against one wall, left behind by whoever had used the place last. Samuel got a fire going quickly, then settled in to wait out the storm. The blizzard raged for 3 days. Samuel had enough food in his saddlebags for perhaps 1 day, but he supplemented it by setting snares for rabbits and managing to catch several fish through a hole he chopped in the ice covering a nearby beaver pond. It wasn't comfortable, but it was survivable. On the 4th morning he woke to silence. He woke. The wind had died during the night, and when he stepped outside, the world had been transformed into a crystalline wonderland. Snow lay 3 feet deep across the prairie, sculpted by the wind into fantastic drifts and formations. The sun blazed from a sky so blue it hurt to look at, and the air was so clear he felt like he could see all the way to the mountains. Samuel was contemplating the long walk home when he heard the sound of horses approaching. He stepped outside to see 5 riders coming across the snow, and his heart leaped when he recognized his own sorrel in the lead. Washakie sat astride Dancer like he owned him, and behind him rode 4 younger Shoshone men, leading a string of spare horses. "Samuel Cordero," Washakie called out as they approached. "We have come to return your horse and to ensure you survived the storm." Samuel grinned as he walked out to meet them. "Chief Washakie, I have to admit, I'm mighty glad to see you. That was quite a storm." Washakie dismounted and handed Samuel the reins to his horse. "Dancer carried me safely to your ranch as you promised. I tended him well and made sure he was fed and rested before beginning the journey back." "You went to my ranch?" Samuel asked in surprise. "Where else? You gave me directions to shelter and I followed them. I hope you do not mind that I made use of your hospitality in your absence." Samuel laughed. "Mind? Chief, you probably kept my water pipes from freezing and my stock from dying. I should be thanking you." One of the younger warriors spoke rapidly in Shoshone, and Washakie nodded thoughtfully before turning back to Samuel. "My nephew asks an interesting question. He wants to know why you trusted me with your horse and your home." Samuel considered the question. "Because a man's character shows in how he treats his animals and his word. Your horse was well cared for, and you spoke honestly about your situation. That told me what kind of man you are." Washakie translated for his companions, and Samuel saw several of them nod with what looked like approval. The chief studied Samuel's face carefully. "You are not like most white men I have known," Washakie said finally. "Most see my people as either savage enemies or foolish children. You see us as simply men, no different from yourself, except in the color of our skin and the way we choose to live." "That's about the size of it," Samuel agreed. "I figure people are people, regardless of what they look like or where they come from. Some are good, some are bad, most are somewhere in between." Washakie was quiet for a long moment, then made a decision that would change Samuel's life forever. "Would you be willing to come with us to our winter camp? There are things I would like to show you, ways I would like to repay your kindness." Samuel looked at the group of mounted warriors, realizing that this was probably a rare honor. "I'd be pleased to come, Chief, but I should warn you, I don't know much about Shoshone customs. I wouldn't want to offend anyone accidentally." "You will not offend," Washakie assured him. "Your actions have already spoken louder than any words could. My people will see you as I see you, a man of honor who helped a stranger in need." The ride to the Shoshone winter camp took most of the day, following hidden trails through country that Samuel had thought he knew well. But Washakie and his men led him to places he had never seen, sheltered valleys, hidden springs, caves that could shelter travelers from the worst weather. It was like discovering a secret world that existed parallel to the one he knew. The camp itself was hidden in a box canyon, so perfectly concealed that Samuel would have ridden past it a dozen times without noticing the entrance. But inside, it was a thriving community of several hundred people, their lodges arranged in careful patterns that seemed to follow some ancient tradition. Samuel's arrival caused quite a stir. Children ran out to stare at the white man riding with their chief, while adults watched from doorways with expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion. But Washakie's presence clearly legitimized Samuel's visit, and gradually the people began to approach with something approaching welcome. That evening, the entire camp gathered around a great fire for what Washakie called a telling circle. Samuel found himself seated at the chief's right hand, a position of obvious honor, while Washakie told the story of their meeting and Samuel's generosity. But this wasn't just a simple recounting of events. As Washakie spoke, Samuel began to understand that he was witnessing something profound, the transformation of a simple act of kindness into tribal legend. The chief described not just what had happened, but what it meant, how it reflected on the character of both men and the possibility of understanding between their peoples. When the formal storytelling was finished, individual members of the tribe began approaching Samuel with gifts, beaded moccasins, carved bone tools, pieces of artwork that represented hours of careful labor. Each gift came with a story, an explanation of its significance and the respect it represented. "This is overwhelming," Samuel murmured to Washakie. I don't know how to respond to such generosity. Simply accept it with the same grace you showed when you gave me your horse, Washakie replied. My people honor courage and kindness above all other virtues. You have shown both. Over the following days, Samuel was given a tour of the camp and its surroundings that opened his eyes to a way of life he had never imagined. The Shoshone had been living in this region for centuries, and they had developed an intimate knowledge of the land that went far beyond anything Samuel had learned in his 5 years of ranching. Washakie showed him plants that could be used for medicine, hidden water sources that never failed even in the driest years, signs that could predict weather changes days in advance. He learned to read animal tracks like a book, understanding not just what creatures had passed, but when, in what condition, and for what purpose. Your people see the land as something to be conquered, Washakie explained as they stood on a ridge overlooking Samuel's ranch. You impose your will upon it, forcing it to serve your purposes. My people see the land as a living thing, a partner to be understood and respected. Samuel looked out over his own property with new eyes. I never thought of it that way. I just tried to work with what was here instead of fighting against it. Yes, Washakie said approvingly, that is why you have succeeded where others have failed. You listen to the land instead of simply commanding it. On the 3rd day of his visit, Washakie took Samuel to a place he called the Sacred Spring, a hidden grove where water bubbled up from deep underground, creating a small oasis even in the harsh Wyoming landscape. Ancient petroglyphs covered the rock walls, telling stories that reached back thousands of years. This place has been sacred to my people since the beginning of time, Washakie explained. It is here that young men come for their vision quests, where the spirits speak most clearly to those who know how to listen. Samuel studied the ancient artwork, trying to decipher its meaning. It's beautiful and peaceful. I can see why your people consider it sacred. Washakie nodded. I have brought you here for a reason, Samuel Cordero. This spring lies on your land. Samuel turned to stare at the chief in shock. What? According to the white man's maps and property deeds, this sacred site belongs to you. You own it as surely as you own your ranch house and your cattle. Samuel felt the weight of that revelation settling on his shoulders. He owned one of the most sacred sites in Shoshone culture, a place that had been holy to these people for generations, beyond counting. The legal implications were staggering, but the moral implications were even more profound. I didn't know, he said quietly. When I filed my claim, I had no idea this place existed. Of course you did not. The previous owner never explored this far into the mountains. But now you do know, and the question becomes what you will do with this knowledge. Samuel looked around the sacred grove, understanding that this moment would define not just his relationship with Washakie and his people, but his own sense of himself as a moral being. He could claim legal ownership, deny the Shoshone access to their sacred site, and face no consequences under white man's law. Or he could choose a different path. This place doesn't belong to me, Samuel said finally. It belongs to your people, and it always has. The fact that some government clerk drew lines on a map doesn't change that. Washakie studied his face carefully. You would give up your legal claim to this land? I would never make a legal claim to this land, Samuel corrected. A man can't own something sacred any more than he can own the wind or the stars. All I can do is make sure it's protected. The chief was silent for a long moment, then placed his hand on Samuel's shoulder. You continue to surprise me, Samuel Cordero. Few white men would understand what you have just understood, and fewer still would act upon that understanding. What followed was a ceremony that Samuel would remember for the rest of his life. Washakie sent word to the other bands of the tribe, and within days, representatives from across the region had gathered at the sacred spring. Samuel found himself at the center of a ritual that formally recognized him as a guardian of the sacred site, with all the responsibilities and honors that entailed. But the ceremony also marked the beginning of something unprecedented, a formal alliance between a white rancher and the Shoshone Nation. Not a treaty negotiated by governments, but a personal bond forged between individuals who had learned to see past surface differences to the fundamental humanity beneath. From this day forward, Washakie declared before the assembled crowd, Samuel Cordero will be known among our people as friend to the land. He will have the right to call upon us for aid, and we will have the right to call upon him. His enemies will be our enemies, and our friends will be his friends. Samuel felt the weight of the title and the responsibility it carried. I don't know if I'm worthy of such an honor. Worthiness is not determined by birth or blood, Washakie replied. It is determined by actions and choices. You have already proven your worth. The practical benefits of the alliance became apparent almost immediately. The Shoshone possessed knowledge of the land that no white settler could match. They knew where to find water during droughts, which plants could provide food during hard times, how to predict weather patterns and animal movements. In exchange, Samuel provided a liaison to the white community, helping to prevent misunderstandings and conflicts that might otherwise have led to violence. The arrangement proved beneficial to both sides. Samuel's ranch prospered as never before, guided by traditional knowledge that helped him work with the natural rhythms of the land instead of against them. His cattle grew fat on grasses the Shoshone showed him. His crops flourished with irrigation techniques perfected over centuries, and his property became a model of sustainable agriculture that other ranchers began to study and emulate. Meanwhile, the Shoshone found in Samuel an advocate who could speak for them in the white world. When government officials proposed policies that would be harmful to the tribe, Samuel was there to explain the consequences and suggest alternatives. When misunderstandings arose between individual Shoshone and white settlers, he served as a mediator who was trusted by both sides. The relationship deepened over the years as Samuel learned more about Shoshone culture and philosophy. He spent portions of each winter in their camps, learning their language and customs, while members of the tribe regularly visited his ranch to share knowledge and maintain their friendship. One of the most significant developments came when Washakie approached him with a proposal that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. My people are being forced to adapt to a changing world, the chief explained during one of their regular meetings at the sacred spring. The old ways of life are disappearing, and our young people must learn new skills if they are to survive. Would you be willing to help us establish a school? Samuel was intrigued. What kind of school? A place where Shoshone children could learn to read and write in English, to understand mathematics and the ways of white men's business, but also a place where white children could learn our language and our traditional knowledge of the land. A school that would prepare both peoples for a future where they must live together. And the idea was revolutionary for its time, an integrated school where native and white children would learn together, sharing knowledge and building friendships that could last lifetimes. It faced fierce opposition from extremists on both sides, but Samuel's reputation and Washakie's influence gradually overcame the resistance. The school was built in a neutral valley between the reservation and the white settlements, funded by contributions from both communities. Samuel served as its first principal, while Washakie and other tribal elders taught traditional subjects like hunting, tracking, and plant medicine. Within a few years, the school had produced a generation of young people who saw each other as individuals rather than enemies. Shoshone students went on to become successful businessmen and professionals, while white students used their knowledge of native culture to become better farmers, ranchers, and community leaders. The success of the school attracted attention from across the territory and beyond. Educators, government officials, and social reformers came to study the experiment in integrated education, and many went away convinced that it represented the future of Indian-white relations. But perhaps the most significant visitor was a young Shoshone woman named Ayanna, Washakie's granddaughter, who had been educated at the school and had gone on to study at a university in the East. When she returned to Wyoming, she brought with her new ideas about how traditional knowledge could be combined with modern methods to create sustainable communities. "Grandfather has told me of your friendship," she said to Samuel during her first visit to his ranch, "how you gave him your horse when he was stranded, and how that simple act of kindness grew into something that changed both your peoples." Samuel, now in his 50s and graying at the temples, smiled at the memory. "Your grandfather taught me more than I ever taught him. He showed me how to really see the land, how to understand it instead of just using it." Ayana nodded. "That knowledge is precious, but it will be lost if we don't find ways to preserve it and pass it on. I want to create a library, a place where the traditional knowledge of my people can be recorded and studied alongside the best of white men's learning." The library became Ayana's life work, and Samuel one of its most enthusiastic supporters. Together they documented everything from traditional medicines and farming techniques to stories and songs that had been passed down through generations. The collection grew to include not just Shoshone knowledge, but wisdom from tribes across the region, creating a repository of indigenous learning that scholars would study for decades to come. As Samuel entered his later years, he often reflected on the chain of events that had begun with a simple act of kindness on a windswept prairie. He had given his horse to a stranded stranger, expecting nothing in return, and had received in exchange something beyond price, a deeper understanding of the land he lived on and his place within the larger web of life. Washakie, now ancient but still sharp, continued to visit the sacred spring regularly, often accompanied by Samuel and other friends they had made over the years. The site had become a symbol of what was possible when people chose cooperation over conflict, understanding over fear. "Do you ever regret it?" Washakie asked during one of their visits, gesturing toward the spring and the carved symbols that surrounded it. "Giving up your legal claim to this place?" Samuel shook his head. "How can you regret doing the right thing? This place was never mine to claim. I was just lucky enough to be chosen as its guardian." "You were chosen for good reason," Washakie replied. "The spirits saw in you what I saw, a man who understood that true ownership comes not from papers and laws, but from love and responsibility." When Samuel finally passed away at the age of 71, his funeral drew people from across the territory and beyond. Shoshone families traveled hundreds of miles to pay their respects, while white ranchers and officials who had once opposed his work with the tribe came to acknowledge the positive changes he had helped bring about. He was buried in a simple ceremony at the sacred spring, in accordance with his wishes and Shoshone tradition. The grave marker, carved from local stone, bore inscriptions in both English and Shoshone, identifying him as Samuel Cordero, friend to the land, guardian of sacred places. But his true monument was the living legacy he left behind. The school that continued to educate children of both races, the library that preserved traditional knowledge for future generations, the countless individuals whose lives had been changed by his example of what was possible when people chose kindness over suspicion. Washakie lived for another 5 years after Samuel's death, and he often spoke of their friendship as proof that understanding between peoples was not only possible, but inevitable when guided by wisdom and goodwill. The alliance they had forged continued long after both men were gone, providing a model for cooperation that influenced Indian-white relations throughout the American West. Years later, when historians studied the settlement of Wyoming Territory, they would note that one region had been largely spared the violent conflicts that characterized so much of the frontier period. They would attribute this peace to the unusual alliance between a white rancher and a Shoshone chief, two men who had discovered that the act of giving could transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. The sacred spring continued to be protected and honored, eventually becoming a state park where visitors could learn about both the natural history of the region and the cultural exchange that had preserved it. The petroglyphs on its walls remained as vivid as ever, their ancient messages joined by newer symbols that told the story of friendship between peoples who had once been enemies. And in the visitor center that stood near the spring, the story was told again and again of how a simple act of generosity, a rancher giving his horse to a stranded chief, had grown into something that changed the course of history. It served as a reminder that the greatest treasures are often found not in what we keep for ourselves, but in what we choose to give away.